Hello there, dear listener. Welcome to tonight's tales for the nocturnal historians such as yourself. I'm so glad you've chosen to spend some time with me as we explore the hidden corners of history together. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and share. And if you enjoy these calm, immersive dives into the past, I invite you to subscribe for more relaxing journeys through time. Now make yourself comfortable, settle in, and let your mind drift as we travel back to a very different era, an era of kings and peasants, of plagues and superstitions, of rough justice and public spectacle. Picture, if you will, a town square bustling with activity, merchants hawking their wares, children playing, animals milling about, but there's a palpable tension in the air. A wooden platform has been erected in the center of the square, and upon it stands a dark, hooded figure. This is the executioner, a man both reviled and feared, but utterly necessary in the brutal machinery of medieval justice. The crowd parts as a ragged prisoner is led to the platform, hands bound. The executioner grips his axe and prepares to dispatch the condemned soul to the next world. It's a grim scene, one that was all too common in towns across Europe for centuries. The medieval period was an age of harsh punishments. Thieves had their hands cut off, blasphemers had their tongues removed, and murderers, traitors, and heretics faced the ultimate penalty. A public execution, whether by beheading, hanging, burning at the stake, or methods even more gruesome. At the center of it all was the executioner, a man tasked with the bloody business of torture and death. It's difficult for us to imagine the kind of person who could fill such a role. But behind the dark hood and fearsome reputation, the executioner was a human being with a life and a story all his own. Over the next hour or so, we'll peer into the shadows and uncover what life was really like for the medieval executioner. We'll examine how one became an executioner and what a typical day in this macabre profession entailed. We'll meet some of the most famous and infamous executioners in history, from France to England, and learn how they coped with their dark duties. Through it all, we'll grapple with some profound questions. What kind of society needs an executioner in the first place? How did the executioners themselves reconcile their grim work with their conscience and their faith? And what does the executioner's existence say about the very human impulse for retribution and violence? Heavy questions, to be sure, but as your lids grow heavy, I invite you to ponder them with me, to let your imagination roam free and see these distant lives and times through fresh eyes. So let us begin our tale in a time long past, when life was nasty, brutish, and short, and justice was swift and merciless, when one shadowy figure loomed large in the public imagination, the hooded man with the axe, the medieval executioner. Our story begins, as many executioner stories did, with family. You see, the job of executioner was often passed down from father to son, sometimes for generations. In a world where bloodlines determined so much of one's fate, even this grim occupation could become a family trade. Such was the case for one of history's most prolific and storied executioners, Charles Henry Sanson of Paris. Born in 1739, Charles Henry was the son of an executioner dynasty stretching back to the 1600s. His great-grandfather, a common soldier named Charles Sanson, had first taken up the axe in service to King Louis XIII. The Sanson patriarchs had been state executioners ever since, presiding over the offing of the king's enemies with practiced detachment. For Charles-Henri, following in his forefathers' footsteps must have felt all but inevitable. As a small boy, he watched his father, also named Charles, depart for the day's grim work. In the evenings, Charles would return, his dark cloak spattered with blood, his eyes distant. Though they rarely spoke of it, young Charles-Henri knew his own future was tied up with the blade and the block. Other executioners came to their profession by chance or necessity rather than birth. Take Francois Barreau plying his trade in the south of France in the early 1500s. Francois had been an orphan, a ward of the church, with few prospects, until the day his town's aging executioner, childless and alone, took Francois as his apprentice. Under the old master's tutelage, Francois learned the tools of the trade, the proper way to swing an axe, to measure a length of rope, to tighten a rack. They were lessons in brutality, but to Francois they were a path out of poverty, a way to make a living, to have a place in the world, however low and loathed it might be. Apprenticeships like these were common in the medieval period, when the secrets of the execution trade were jealously guarded. A novice headsman might spend years assisting his master, learning each technique through repetition and routine. Only when the old executioner retired or died could his apprentice assume the full mantle, the dark hood and cloak that marked him as the town's dispenser of death. But the education of the executioner went beyond mere technical skill. He had to study anatomy, learning the precise angle to sever head from body, the exact pressure to snap neck and spine. For in a perverse way, the executioner's chief aim was to minimize suffering. A swift, clean death was considered a mercy, a last kindness to the condemned. More than this, the executioner had to steel himself for the mental and emotional toll of his work. To witness agony and death day after day and still maintain composure, to feel the hot blood on his hands, hear the jeers of the crowd and keep a heart of ice. It's little wonder then that executioners were marked men, set apart from society by their fearsome duties. In France, the executioner was required to wear distinctive red clothing off duty, lest he be mistaken for an ordinary citizen. In Germany, he often lived in a special house outside town, provided by the authorities, but shunned by the populace. The training of the executioner then encompassed far more than the mere mechanics of killing. It was a preparation for a life of isolation and infamy, a life that would demand a terrible price, as we'll see. But first, let us imagine ourselves in the executioner's shoes on a day when his services are required. Dawn breaks cold and grey over the sleeping town. In his stone cottage on the outskirts, the executioner rises from a fitful sleep. He dresses silently, his mind already fixed on the work ahead. He makes his way to the town square, deserted in the early morning chill. There he begins his preparations. He checks the scaffold, ensures the trapdoor is well oiled and functioning. He inspects his tools, the axe, the rope, the pincers, the implements of his trade. As he works, his mind wanders to the prisoner languishing in the dungeon, a beggar convicted of theft, or perhaps a young woman accused of witchcraft. He wonders if they'll meet their fate bravely or collapse in trembling fear. But it is not his place to question their guilt or innocence. That was for the magistrates and courts to decide. He is but the instrument of their justice, as implacable and impersonal as the blade itself. By mid-morning, a crowd has gathered, townsfolk eager for a spectacle. The prisoner is led out, pale and shackled. The executioner guides them up the steps of the scaffold as a clear reads out the charges and sentence. Then it is time. With a whispered prayer, a steadying breath, the executioner takes up his tool. The prisoner kneels, bowing their head. A hush falls over the square, and in one swift, practiced motion, it is done. A life extinguished, a judgment rendered in blood. But the executioner's day is far from over. There is still the messy business of clean-up, disposing of the body, washing away the gore. And there may be other punishments to be carried out. A public whipping for a pickpocket, perhaps the removal of a blasphemer's tongue. Each sentence a fresh horror. As the sun sinks low over the town walls, the executioner makes his weary way home. His hood is spattered, his tools wrapped in stained cloth. He feels the townspeople's eyes upon him, fearful, accusing. Even the children scatter at his approach, called back by their mothers. Alone in his cottage, he contemplates the nature of his work. Is he a righteous servant of the law, or a base murderer sanctioned by the state? Does delivering a quick death truly absolve him, or is his soul forever stained? These are the doubts that plague the executioner in the dark watches of the night. The price he pays for his grisly trade, and yet come morning he will take up the axe once more, for this is the only life he has ever known. Such was the lot of the average executioner, toiling day by day in obscurity. But some few names from this shadowed profession stand out in the annals of history. Men whose deeds, for good or ill, ensured their own strange kind of fame. Pause. After the crowds had dispersed and the last echoes of the condemned man's final pleas had faded into silence, the executioner was left alone in the town square, the weight of his grim duty hanging heavy upon his shoulders. With methodical precision, he began the morbid task of cleaning up the aftermath of the execution. Blood stained the rough cobblestones, a macabre testament to the life that had been extinguished by his hand. The executioner moved with the efficient, practiced motions of a man who had performed this dark ritual countless times before. He gathered up the lifeless body, now devoid of the spark of vitality that had animated it mere moments ago, and prepared it for disposal. In some cases, the remains would be claimed by family members for a proper burial, but more often than not, the earthly vessel of the condemned would be unceremoniously dumped into an unmarked grave, forever lost to history. As he worked, the executioner's mind wandered to the paradoxical nature of his existence. He was a man both reviled and revered, feared and respected in equal measure. His was a life lived on the fringes of society, forever tainted by the blood that stained his hands. Yet at the same time, he was a necessary cog in the machinery of medieval justice, a grim but vital instrument in maintaining the social order. It was a role that had been thrust upon him by the accident of his birth, a family legacy passed down through generations like a dark heirloom. His father had been an executioner before him, as had his grandfather and great-grandfather before that. It was a lineage steeped in death and suffering, a dynasty built upon the foundation of the scaffold and the blade. From a young age, the executioner had been groomed for his grim destiny. He had apprenticed under his father, learning the intricate techniques of the trade, the precise angle at which to swing the axe, the proper tension to apply to the noose, the most efficient way to separate head from body with a single, swift stroke. He had studied anatomy, learning the secrets of the human form so that he might dispatch his victims with a minimum of suffering. But no amount of training could truly prepare one for the emotional and psychological toll of the job. Each execution left its mark upon the soul, a shadow that could never be fully erased. In the quiet moments between the blood and the screams, the executioner was forced to confront the weight of what he had done, to grapple with the knowledge that he had snuffed out a life, regardless of whether that life had been deemed worthy of extinguishing by the powers that be. It was a burden that few could understand, a pain that he was forced to bear alone. For all the fear and respect he commanded, the executioner was at his core a deeply lonely figure. He lived apart from the rest of society, ostracized by the very community he served. His was a world of shadows and secrets, a realm where the normal rules and rhythms of life held no sway. But perhaps the greatest irony of the executioner's existence was the fact that in many ways he was more intimately acquainted with death than even those he dispatched to the afterlife. He had stared into the face of mortality on a daily basis, had grappled with the fundamental questions of life and its value in a way that few others could comprehend. In the end, the executioner was a man trapped between two worlds, the realm of the living and the domain of the dead. He straddled the boundary between light and darkness, forever caught in the liminal space between the sacred and the profane. It was a lonely, harrowing existence, but one that he had been born to endure. As he finished his grim work and prepared to depart the now silent square, the executioner couldn't help but reflect on the strange twists of fate that had led him to this moment. He had never asked for this life, had never sought out the mantle of death's messenger. But now, as he walked away from the scene of his latest handiwork, he knew that he would continue to play his role to serve as the impartial instrument of justice in a world that cried out for both vengeance and mercy. For he was the executioner, the final arbiter of life and death, the grim reaper incarnate. And though his was a lonely, brutal existence, he knew that it was one that served a vital purpose in the grand tapestry of history. He was a necessary evil, a dark but essential thread woven into the fabric of medieval society. As he disappeared into the shadows of the night, the executioner carried with him the weight of the lives he had taken, the souls he had ushered into the great beyond. It was a burden he would bear for the rest of his days, a grim reminder of the terrible responsibility he had been charged with, but it was a responsibility he would continue to fulfill for as long as there was breath in his body and strength in his arm. For such was the lot of the medieval executioner, to live and die in the service of death itself, to forever dwell in the twilight realm between the gallows and the grave. It was a fate few would envy, but one that he had come to accept as his own. A dark destiny forged in the fires of history and sealed with the blood of the condemned. In the annals of medieval history, few figures loom as large or cast as dark a shadow as the executioner. Theirs was a trade steeped in blood and shrouded in mystery, a grim vocation that placed them at the center of some of the most pivotal moments in the story of human civilization. One such figure was Charles Henry Sanson, the royal executioner of Paris, who served under King Louis XVI during the tumultuous years of the French Revolution. Born into a dynasty of executioners that stretched back to the early 1600s, Sanson was destined from birth to follow in the footsteps of his forebears, to take up the mantle of the blade and the noose. But Sanson was no ordinary executioner. Over the course of his long and storied career, he personally dispatched nearly 3,000 individuals, from common criminals to aristocrats, and even in a shocking turn of events, the king himself. It was a staggering tally, a testament to both Sanson's skill and the sheer scale of the bloodshed that marked the French Revolution. Despite the grim nature of his work, Sanson was known for his professionalism and his dedication to his craft. He took great pride in his ability to dispatch his victims swiftly and efficiently with a minimum of suffering. In an era when public executions were often prolonged and gruesome spectacles, Sanson sought to bring a measure of dignity and humanity to the proceedings to grant his victims a clean and merciful death. But even for a man as steeped in death as Sanson, the sheer volume of executions he presided over during the Revolution took a profound emotional and psychological toll. In his private moments, Sanson grappled with the moral implications of his work, struggling to reconcile his duty to the state with his own sense of right and wrong. It was a struggle that would come to a head on January 21st, 1793, when Sanson was called upon to execute King Louis I himself. In a stunning reversal of fortune, the man who had once wielded the power of life and death over his subjects was now at the mercy of the very instrument of justice he had once commanded. For Sanson, it was a moment of profound historical significance, a turning point in the story of France and the world. But it was also a moment of great personal anguish as he grappled with the weight of what he had been asked to do. In the end, Sanson carried out his duty with the same professionalism and skill he had brought to all his previous executions. But the experience left an indelible mark upon his psyche, a scar that would never fully heal. In the years that followed, Sanson continued to ply his grim trade, presiding over the executions of Marie Antoinette and countless other victims of the Reign of Terror. But even as he went through the motions of his dark ritual, he could feel the toll it was taking on his soul. As he entered his final years, Sanson turned his attention to securing his legacy, to ensuring that the knowledge and skills he had accumulated over a lifetime of service would not be lost. He took on his own son as an apprentice, teaching him the secrets of the trade, just as his own father had taught him. It was a bittersweet moment for Sanson as he contemplated the end of his own journey and the beginning of his son's. He knew all too well the burden that his child would be taking on, the dark mantle that he would be forced to wear for the rest of his days. But he also knew that it was a necessary evil, a grim but vital service that someone would always need to provide. And so as he lay on his deathbed, his life's work finally complete, Charles Henry Sanson could rest easy in the knowledge that he had fulfilled his destiny, that he had played his part in the great drama of history. He had lived a life in the shadow of the scaffold, a life steeped in blood and sorrow. But he had also lived a life of purpose and meaning, a life dedicated to the pursuit of justice, however dark and twisted that justice might be. In the end, Sanson's story is a testament to the strange and complex role that executioners played in medieval and early modern society. They were figures of fear and fascination, reviled and respected in equal measure. They were the embodiment of the state's ultimate power over life and death. The living incarnation of the idea that sometimes, in order for society to function, blood must be spilled and lives must be taken, but they were also human beings, individuals with their own hopes and dreams, their own fears and doubts. They were men and women who had been born into a dark and terrible destiny, who had taken up the mantle of death out of duty and necessity rather than choice. And it is in this duality that the true tragedy of the executioner's life can be found, for even as they performed a vital service for their society, They were forever tainted by the nature of their work, forever set apart from the rest of humanity. They were the dark angels of the medieval world, the grim reapers who walked among the living, forever balanced on the razor's edge between life and death. It is a legacy that echoes down through the centuries, a reminder of the terrible toll that the pursuit of justice can take on the human soul. And it is a legacy that we would do well to remember even as we move forward into a brighter and more humane future. For in the end, the story of the medieval executioner is the story of us all. A tale of darkness and light, of cruelty and compassion, of the eternal struggle between the better angels of our nature and the demons that lurk within the human heart. It is a story that reminds us of how far we have come as a species and how far we still have to go. And so, as we look back on the grim annals of history, let us remember the executioners, those dark and tragic figures who played such a vital role in shaping the world we know today. Let us remember their skill and their dedication, their sacrifice and their sorrow. But most of all, let us remember their humanity, the flickering spark of light that stubbornly persisted even in the darkest corners of the human experience. For in the end, it is that humanity that defines us, that sets us apart from the beasts and the monsters. It is that humanity that gives us hope even in the face of the most terrible and unspeakable acts. And it is that humanity that we must cling to now and always as we strive to build a better and more just world for ourselves and for generations yet to come. For in the end, we are all executioners in our own way, all of us complicit in the great and terrible drama of life and death that plays out on the stage of history. But we are also all human beings, blessed with the power to choose, to change, to grow. And it is in that power that our greatest hope lies. The hope for a world where justice is tempered with mercy, where cruelty gives way to compassion, and where even the darkest corners of the human experience are illuminated by the light of understanding and love. So let us remember the executioners, those grim and tragic figures who walked in the shadow of the scaffold. But let us also remember the light that flickers within us all, the stubborn spark of humanity that refuses to be extinguished no matter how dark the night may seem. For in the end, it is that light that will guide us forward, that will lead us out of the darkness and into a brighter and more hopeful tomorrow. And it is that light that will ensure that the story of the executioner, for all its sorrow and all its tragedy, is ultimately a story of hope. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit will always find a way to endure, to overcome, and to triumph. As the executioner's heavy footfalls echoed through the dungeon passageway, the condemned man's ragged breath quickened, flickering torchlight danced across damp stone walls, casting eerie shadows that seemed to reach out like grasping fingers. The prisoner rattled his chains in a futile plea, but the executioner's face betrayed no hint of mercy. This was merely another day's work for him, another wretched soul to dispatch. Many assume the medieval executioner was little more than a mindless brute, a sadist who reveled in the gruesome task of dealing death. But the reality was often far more complex. For most executioners, this macabre profession was a family trade passed down through generations, almost like a dark inheritance. Young boys weren't given a choice. As soon as they were old enough, they began apprenticing under their fathers or uncles, learning the grim tools of the trade that would forever set them apart. Training was rigorous, a process of both physical and mental conditioning. A swift, precise death was considered the bare minimum of competency. Executioners had to master a wide array of instruments, from the iconic axe and sword to more esoteric devices like the breaking wheel. Each required a different technique to ensure maximum efficiency. But brute strength alone wasn't enough. Executioners also needed an intimate knowledge of human anatomy, a keen awareness of where to strike to bring a swift end. They pored over medical texts and studied the bodies of the dead, learning the map of blood vessels, organs, and bones. A botched execution could mean prolonged agony for the condemned, and that simply wouldn't do. Not out of compassion, mind you. A clean death was simply a mark of professional pride. Perhaps even more important than the physical skills was the mental conditioning an apprentice executioner endured. To look into the eyes of the condemned day after day and then snuff the life from their bodies without flinching, that required a certain hardness of spirit. Some called it cruelty, others necessity. As part of their training, young executioners were forced to confront death in all its forms. They accompanied their mentors to public tortures and executions, watching impassively as bodies were broken and blood spilled. They learned to tune out the screams and pleading to steel their hearts against the raw, human desperation on display. It was a hard lesson, but a vital one. Hesitation or mercy had no place on the scaffold. Of course, not every aspiring executioner could handle the emotional toll of the job. It took a certain kind of person to kill without guilt or doubt. Some apprentices washed out, unable to stomach the relentless parade of death. But those who endured emerged changed in some fundamental way. They had stared into the abyss of human suffering and come out the other side. The training complete, a new executioner took his place as a pillar of the medieval justice system. His was a strange role, reviled and necessary in equal measure. Townsfolk might avert their gaze as he passed in the street, but they also slept more soundly knowing he was there, a grim guardian keeping anarchy at bay. But just what did a typical day look like for an executioner? As dawn's first light crept over the horizon, he was already up and preparing for the grim work ahead. There were blades to sharpen, ropes to check for fraying, and 100 other little details to manage. A malfunctioning tool could spell disaster on the scaffold. An executioner's mornings were often spent presiding over public displays of punishment, a crucial part of the medieval justice system. Petty thieves might be whipped until their skin hung in bloody ribbons. More serious offenders could lose an ear, a hand, or even a limb. All the while, the executioner stood impassively by, his face a mask of professional detachment. As the day wore on, the time for an execution drew near. Crowds began to gather in the town square, jostling for a good view of the macabre spectacle. The mood was strangely festive, with vendors selling meat pies and ale to the eager onlookers. Public executions were the medieval equivalent of mass entertainment, a brief respite from the drudgery of peasant life. Through it all, the executioner was a figure of fear and fascination. Children dared each other to touch his black robe for good luck. Some even believed his sweat or blood could cure ailments, a superstition the executioner was all too happy to exploit for a few extra coins. At last, the appointed hour arrived. The condemned was led out, hands bound, face pale with dread. A priest muttered last rites, though any hope of divine mercy seemed laughably hollow. The executioner tested the edge of his blade, adjusted the block, and then with a nod from the magistrate, it was time. A hush fell over the crowd as the executioner took his position. The world seemed to narrow to that one moment, that singular act of violence. With a whistle of steel through air, it was over in an instant. The head tumbled into a waiting basket, a spray of vivid crimson staining the stage. As the crowd erupted into cheers and jeers, the executioner calmly wiped his blade clean. For him, death was simply a job like any other. But even he couldn't escape a twinge of something, not quite remorse, but a grim acknowledgement of the weight of his actions. Each life he took left an invisible mark on his soul, a dark stain that could never quite be scrubbed away. With the execution complete, there was still much to be done. The body and head to be gathered up for display or disposal. The blood had to be scrubbed from the scaffold, the tools cleaned and put away. An executioner's work was never truly finished. As the last of the crimson faded and the crowd dispersed back to their lives, the executioner retreated to his home on the outskirts of town. Even among the poorest and most desperate, few wanted an executioner for a neighbor. The miasma of death clung to him, an invisible barrier isolating him from the rest of humanity. But even in his solitude, the executioner couldn't escape the specter of his grim trade. The faces of the condemned haunted his dreams, their final pleasing in his mind. Some turned to drink to dull the memories, others became consumed by religious fervor, desperately seeking absolution for their bloody deeds. But for most, the life of an executioner was one of grim acceptance. They were the sin-eaters of medieval society, the ones who shouldered the burden of necessary violence so that others could sleep with a clear conscience. It was a lonely, damning path to walk. One of the most famous executioners to walk that path was Shah-Khri Sanson, the royal executioner of Paris in the late 18th century. Born into a dynasty of executioners stretching back to the 1600s, Sanson was practically fated for the role. But even he struggled with the toll of the job. Over his long career, Sanson personally dispatched nearly 3,000 souls from common thieves to aristocrats and even the king himself during the Reign of Terror. He took pride in his work, seeing it as a vital public service, but he also sought to minimize suffering where he could, pioneering a more humane method of execution with the swift slice of the guillotine. As the revolution raged and the orders poured in, Sanson found himself grappling with a growing sense of doubt. Each trip to the scaffold chipped away at his resolve, his belief in the righteousness of his actions. In the quiet moments, the faces of his victims, men, women, even children, swam before his eyes. Sanson was a man torn between duty and conscience, a living embodiment of the executioner's paradox. He had been born into this life, molded for it since childhood, and yet as the years wore on, the weight of all that death began to crush his spirit. Even as he continued to carry out his grim work with stoic professionalism, something inside him withered and died. In the end, Sanson did the only thing he could. He poured his knowledge into his eldest son, preparing him to take up the family mantle. It was a bitter inheritance, one that would damn his child to the same twilight existence. But in a society built on blood and steel, the executioner was a necessary evil. Someone had to bear that cross. Not all executioners were quite as tormented by their lot as Sanson. Take Thomas Assern, the hangman of Yorkshire in the late 1500s. While he dispatched his share of criminals with brutal efficiency, Ascan was always looking for a way to turn a profit from his grim reputation. He hit upon a particularly clever scheme, selling talismans and cures allegedly imbued with the power of his deadly trade. Scraps of hanging ropes, locks of condemned hair, even vials of his own bathwater. As marketed them all as powerful remedies for everything from toothache to infertility. Never mind that it was all hogwash. The fearful and the desperate flocked to buy Assan's grisly wares, hoping to harness some of the executioner's dark mystique for their own purposes. And Asen was all too happy to oblige, pocketing a tidy fortune in the process. It was a testament to the executioner's strange place in the medieval psyche, feared and reviled, yet also imbued with an almost supernatural aura in a world steeped in blood and superstition. Even the lowly hangman could become a figure of legend. Of course, the reality was often far less glamorous. For every Thomas Askern working the crowd, there were dozens of executioners living in squalor and despair, shunned by the society they served. Many sank into madness or took their own lives, unable to bear the weight of their bloody deeds. It was a thankless existence, one that left even the strongest men hollowed out husks of themselves. They wielded great power over life and death, these reapers of men, but at what cost to their own souls? As the centuries turned and medieval gave way to modern, the executioner's lot began to change. Public spectacles of death fell out of favor, replaced by more clinical bureaucratic methods. The gallows and chopping block were traded for gas chambers and electric chairs, impersonal instruments of state-sanctioned death. But even in this new age, the shadow of the executioner lingered. Johann Reichardt, Bavaria's chief executioner in the early 20th century, bore that shadow as heavily as any of his medieval predecessors. A quiet, unassuming man, Reichardt dispatched nearly 3,000 prisoners over his long career, including a number of high-ranking Nazis in the aftermath of World War II. Like Sanson before him, Reichardt struggled with the moral burden of his work. He sought solace in scrupulous adherence to procedure, in the belief that he was merely an instrument of the law. But in the still of the night, the doubts crept in, the faces of the dead floating before him in silent accusation. In the end, Reichardt met the fate of so many executioners before him, a slow slide into obscurity. His name fading from public memory as the world moved on. The once mighty figure of the headsman had become little more than a historical curiosity, a relic of a darker, bloodier time. And yet for all the progress we like to believe we've made, the spectre of the executioner is never far away. In parts of the world, public beheadings and stonings are still a grim reality. Even in supposedly civilized nations, the machinery of death grinds on behind prison walls, sanitized and industrialized, but no less final for its victims. Perhaps that is the executioner's true legacy. Not the gore and spectacle, but the unshakable reminder of our own capacity for brutality. In every age, we find ways to justify the unjustifiable, to cloak violence in the guise of justice. And in doing so, we create the need for those grim, haunted men who kill in our name. So spare a thought for the executioners of old, those damned souls who walked in the shadow of death. Theirs was a burden few could bear, a sacrifice of spirit on the altar of necessary evil. In the end, perhaps they were not so different from their victims. Both trapped in the gears of a merciless machine, ground down by the weight of human cruelty. As we close our eyes and drift off into the merciful oblivion of sleep, let the executioner story be a reminder to hold fast to our humanity, even in the face of the darkness within. For in the end, it is not the axe or the rope that defines us, but the choices we make, the compassion we show in the brief flicker of life we are granted. Let us use it wisely and well. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the executioner methodically wiped down his heavy blade, his eyes fixed on the task with a sense of grim determination. Tomorrow would bring yet another public beheading. A young noblewoman convicted of adultery. The crowd would jeer and cheer as her head rolled, but for the executioner it was all in a day's work. This was the plight of the medieval headsman, a figure both reviled and revered in the minds of the people. On one hand, executioners were seen as a necessary evil, the grisly hand of justice that kept order in a turbulent world. They were the ones tasked with meting out the ultimate punishment to those who transgressed against the laws of God and man. In a time when life was often brutish and short, the executioner's swift blade could be seen as a mercy, a quicker end than a slow death from disease or starvation. Yet for all their vital role in society, executioners were also deeply feared and loathed. To kill in the name of the law was still to kill, and those who dealt in death were often shunned as pariahs. Many executioners lived lonely lives on the edges of towns, forbidden from mixing with ordinary folk. Even their own families were tainted by association, their children mocked and ostracized. It was a heavy burden to bear, and one that took a profound toll on the minds and souls of those who wielded the axe. Depression, madness, and drink were all too common among executioners, the weight of their dark deeds eroding their humanity bit by bit. Some found solace in religion, praying fervently for the forgiveness of the lives they'd taken. Others simply hardened their hearts, becoming little more than tools of the state. But how did one even become an executioner in the first place? For many, it was a family trade passed down from father to son in an unbroken line of blood and steel. The skills of the headsman, the precision of the axe stroke, the knack for knots in the noose were not easily learned. They had to be absorbed through years of apprenticeship and grim practice. From a young age, executioner children would assist their fathers in the grisly work, helping to sharpen blades or bind the wrists of the condemned. They watched and learned, steeling themselves for the day when they too would take up the heavy mantle. It was a strange and morbid inheritance, but one that could also confer a certain status. After all, not just anyone could be trusted with the power of life and death. Those executioners who didn't have the luxury of a family legacy had to find other paths into the trade. Some started as common criminals themselves, spared the noose on condition that they turn their hand to the task of execution. Others were simply men of violence and ill root, drawn to the grim work by a taste for blood or the promise of steady employment. Regardless of their origins, all executioners had to undergo a rigorous apprenticeship before they could apply their trade alone. This wasn't just a matter of learning the mechanical techniques of killing, but of preparing oneself mentally and emotionally for a lifetime of dealing death. A key part of the training involved the study of human anatomy. A skilled executioner needed to know exactly where to strike to bring a swift end, minimizing the suffering of the condemned. This meant countless hours spent poring over medical texts or even secretly dissecting the corpses of the executed to better understand the workings of muscle and bone. But no amount of book learning could truly steel an apprentice for the visceral reality of the task. That could only come through hard experience, through taking up the blade again and again until the sight and sounds of death no longer turned the stomach. It was a brutal initiation, a baptism in blood that left an indelible mark on even the hardest of men. Those who survived their grim apprenticeship would go on to become journeyman executioners, travelling from town to town to lend their services as needed. It was a ruthless and unglamorous existence, but it gave many young headsmen their first real taste of the power and responsibility that came with the job. They would preside over public tortures and mutilations, drawing out the suffering of thieves and heretics for the baying crowd. They would perform executions high and low, from the lowliest poacher to errant dukes and duchesses, and always they would bear the weight of their fearsome reputation, cloaked in the dark garb of their trade. Some executioners even became minor celebrities in their own right, famed far and wide for their skill and showmanship on the scaffold. The great French headsman Charles Frisson was one such figure, a man who brought a touch of grim artistry to the business of death. Born into a venerable dynasty of state executioners, Sanson was a master of the cold steel, the gleaming blade of the guillotine. Over the course of his long and bloody career, he personally dispatched nearly 3,000 souls from common cut purses to the King of France himself. Sanson took a perverse pride in his work, seeing himself as an agent of the law rather than a brutal killer. He pioneered new techniques to minimize suffering, such as the swift, downward slice of the bascule rather than the clumsy lateral chop of the old Halifax gibbet. Even in the depths of the Reign of Terror, when the streets of Paris ran red with noble blood, Sanson maintained his professionalism, a steady hand in a time of chaos. But beneath the black mask, Sanson was a man deeply conflicted. In his quieter moments, he would agonize over the morality of his profession, wondering if a more merciful God would forgive him for the ocean of blood on his hands. He sought solace in poetry, scratching out melancholic verses in his journal late into the night. As age and infirmity began to dull his legendary skills, Sanson became ever more preoccupied with his legacy. He took on his own son as an apprentice, determined that the family tradition should endure even as the world changed around them. It was a heavy inheritance, but one the young man shouldered with the same stoic resolve as his father. Sanson's story speaks to the strange duality of the executioner's life. At once reviled and essential, steeped in death, yet clinging to a sense of higher purpose. It was a contradiction that many of his colleagues wrestled with as they went about their grim business. In England, the hangman Thomas Ascan found a unique way to square this circle. By day, he was the scourge of the gallows, a hooded figure of dread looming over the trembling condemned. But by night, Ascan pursued a secret second career as a purveyor of macabre medicines and charms. Using his privileged position, Ascan would harvest grisly ingredients from the bodies of those he executed, the fat of hanged men, the burnt powder of human bones. He would mix these into ointments and potions, which he sold at great profit to those desperate enough to believe in their curative powers. Ascan's most prized relic was the very ropes he used for his hangings. After each execution, he would cut the noose into small segments, which he marketed as talismans against all manner of ills. A piece of Ascan's rope, it was said, could cure everything from headaches to impotence if worn close to the skin. The hangman even bottled and sold the bath water from his own tub, claiming that it had absorbed the mystical essence of his fearsome profession. Gullible customers lined up to buy this morbid holy water, some travelling from Farfield for a sip of the executioner's healing tonic. While Ascan's scheme may seem like a ghoulish joke today, it reflects the peculiar hold that executioners had over the public imagination. For all that they were despised and marginalized, these grim figures were also seen as possessing an eerie power, an intimate familiarity with death, but granted them an almost supernatural aura. This was the executioner's paradox, to be at once necessary and unclean, essential, yet utterly abhorrent. It was a tightrope that every headsman had to walk, navigating the choppy waters of a society that both required their skills and recoiled from their touch. Some executioners leaned into their fearsome reputations, using them as a tool for social advancement. In medieval Germany, executioner dynasties like the Reichards passed their trade down from father to son, building up a kind of grisly aristocracy. They took their place beside princes and archbishops in the convoluted hierarchies of the Holy Roman Empire, respected for their service to the state, even as they were shunned in the street. Other executioners struggled under the weight of their dark calling, buckling beneath the psychological strain of so much legalized bloodshed. Heavy drinking was an occupational hazard for those who couldn't stomach the work sober. Some executioners turned to religion, donating lavishly to the church in a bid to buy back their tarnished souls. Still others fell into madness, babbling to themselves as they paced the draughty halls of their lonely homes. The famous Bavarian executioner, Johann Reichard, knew all too well the toll that his grim profession could take. By day, he played the role of the state's loyal servant, dispatching criminals and dissident with Teutonic efficiency. But at night, the screams of the dying echoed ceaselessly in his dreams. Reichardt found himself the last of a dying breed. In an age when the old certainties were crumbling, as the Nazis swept across Europe, he continued to ply his trade in secret, his services still required by a regime that relied more on the firing squad than the headsman's blade. But even Reichardt could see that the age of the executioner was coming to a close, rendered obsolete by the cold efficiency of the gas chamber and the mechanized slaughter of the camps. In the end, Reichardt met his own grim fate at the hands of the victorious Allies, condemned as a war criminal for his small part in the Holocaust. It was an ignominious end for a man who had only ever seen himself as a servant of the law, a cog in the machine of justice. As Reichardt went to his own death, he might have reflected on the strange and terrible arc of his profession. From the town square of medieval Europe to the blood-soaked abattoirs of the modern age, the executioner had always been a creature of paradox, reviled and necessary in equal measure. But in the end, even the most storied dynasties of death couldn't escape the judgment of history. Today, the figure of the hooded headsman seems like a relic of a distant past, a bogeyman from the bloodier pages of human history. But the legacy of that grim trade still lingers in the shadows of our collective psyche. We may have traded the gallows for the gurney, the axe for the syringe, but the need for some final arbiter of justice endures. And so too does the executioner's burden. That strange and terrible weight borne by those who kill in the name of the law. It's a weight that has crushed many a soul through the ages, even as it has propped up the edifice of civilization. In the end, perhaps that is the executioner's true legacy, to remind us of the darkness that lurks beneath the veneer of justice and the toll that must be paid by those who serve as its instruments. As the first rays of dawn begin to filter through the shuttered windows, the executioner rises from his uneasy slumber. He dons his black hood and heavy gloves, the uniform of his ancient trade. With a last lingering glance at the heavy blade on the wall, he steps out into the morning chill. The world may change, but the work of the executioner remains the same. It's a heavy burden, but one he will shoulder for as long as the law demands. Such is the lot of the medieval headsman, the grim hand of justice in a world of blood and steel. The life of an executioner was one of isolation and inner turmoil, a constant wrestling with the weight of their grim responsibilities. Though they wielded the power of life and death, it came at a steep personal cost. Many executioners turned to vices like drinking or gambling to numb the emotional toll. Some descended into madness, haunted by the faces of the condemned. Yet even in their lowest moments, executioners held a strange status in medieval society. They were outcasts, but also in some ways revered, or at least feared. Their knowledge of life and death made them sought out not just by the courts and kings, but by desperate common folk as well. Picture the scene. A hooded executioner, his weathered hands wringing a length of rough hemp rope as a stream of townspeople approaches bearing coins and trinkets. They've come to beg for scraps of the hangman's rope, believing it can cure their ailments or ward off evil spirits. The executioner obliges with a knowing nod, playing the part of mystic healer. This was the clever scheme of Thomas Ascan, a 16th century hangman in Yorkshire, England. Ascan realized that even as his neighbors shunned him in public, they would still furtively seek him out for favors, and so he gave the people what they wanted, talismans and potions and blessings from an agent of death. Ascan would soak lengths of execution rope in his bath water and sell them at a premium as holy water cures. He carved bits of the wooden gallows into amulets and palmed off personal items from the condemned as morbid relics. It was all quite sacrilegious and assuredly a sham. But Ascan soon grew rich from his side business. The irony was lost on no one, perhaps least of all Ascan himself. By day he was a pariah, but by night a paradoxical saviour peddling life through instruments of death. The same hands that ended lives by the dozen were then turned to hawking counterfeit cures. Ascan may have been a con man, but he was a canny businessman above all. He knew he would never be accepted in respectable society. So instead, he met the people where they were in the fearful shadows. He exploited his own sinister reputation and the superstitions of the age to carve out a more comfortable existence. It's hard to say if Ascan truly believed in his own schemes or was simply a pragmatic opportunist. Perhaps in his own way, he found a deeper meaning or atonement in this double life that made his lethal day job more bearable. But the Ascan story shows the mental gymnastics and subterfuge executioners often resorted to in reconciling their place in the world. For as much as executioners were part of the fabric of medieval life, they paid a heavy price to play their role. The very thing that gave their life purpose also barred them from inclusion, and normally, they were in a sense prisoners and victims of the system just as much as those they put to death. Men like Ascan found ways to profit from their grim reputation. Others retreated into hermit-like isolation. But all across Europe over centuries, executioners grappled with the same fundamental struggle between duty and conscience, power and posthos. This struggle animated the life of perhaps the most famed executioner in European history, Charles Henri Sanson, the royal executioner of Paris. Born in 1740 to a long line of state executioners, Sanson could trace the family trade all the way back to the 1600s. Execution wasn't just Sanson's calling, it was his inescapable birthright. From a young age, Sanson studied the grisly craft under his uncle, learning to coldly dispatch the king's justice with precision and speed. He was a prodigy, mastering execution methods from drawing and quartering to beheading with a variety of swords. But beneath the icy professionalism, Sanson harbored reservations about the toll and fairness of his work. Sanson came of age in a time of growing unrest and intellectual upheaval. Enlightenment ideas about justice and individual rights were spreading, and to the pensive young executioner, the old ways began to feel increasingly brutal and arbitrary. Sanson questioned the morality of torture and the disproportionate targeting of the poor by the justice system. But he was trapped by the gravity of his family legacy and his duty to the crown. He was an integral part of the system. He questioned, bound by reputation, oath, and the immense pressure to uphold the dark Sanson dynasty. By the time revolution erupted in France in 1789, Sanson was already a master executioner. His services would be in high demand as the people turned against the ruling aristocracy. But even as he played his part in enacting revolutionary justice, Sanson's doubts gnawed at him. He locked off the heads of errant royals and troublesome rebels alike, including King Louis V himself in 1793. Each thud of the guillotine blade weighed heavier on Sanson's conscience. Like many executioners, when off the clock, he turned to opium and alcohol to numb his pain and anguish. Ultimately, even in its overthrow, Sanson remained loyal to the French state. He followed his orders like a good soldier, though later writings revealed the trauma and internal conflict he carried. He'd personally executed nearly 3,000 people, and the nightmares and guilt never left him. And yet, for all his brooding and soul-searching, Sanson never broke the chain of family legacy. In his final years, he focused his energy on tutoring his own son, Henri, in the executioner's dark art. The boy would one day inherit his mantle and carry on the Sanson name in blood and beheadings through the reign of terror. The mental and emotional anguish Sanson suffered was the executioner's omnipresent shadow. The nature of the work practically guaranteed post-traumatic stress and deep psychological scars. This was another reason executioners tended to work in family dynasties. The trade required an understanding and hardiness that outsiders lacked. Only a fellow executioner could truly grasp the weight of the role. They were a brotherhood bonded by blood and the uniquely difficult headspace required. Many executioners followed their father's footsteps not out of bloodlust, but because there was simply no one else who could relate to their experience. This created an insular subculture of executioners across Europe who saw their grim business as a higher calling. They took pride in their esoteric techniques and in their mental fortitude to carry out such a taxing task. Only they knew what it took to be the hand of the law. That executioner's mindset is exemplified in the person of Johann Reichardt, who holds the dubious distinction of being the last official executioner in Bavaria, Germany. Reichardt, who came from a 400-year lineage of Bavarian executioners, beheaded nearly 3,200 people between 1924 and 1945. Many of Reichart's victims were petty criminals, political prisoners, or other unfortunates caught in the draconian Nazi justice system. He served the Third Reich with the same sense of dutiful detachment as he had the Weimar government before. Though he later insisted he was no Nazi supporter, Reichardt's job was not to question, but to carry out his orders. Reichard reportedly performed over 200 beheadings in the first few months of 1945 alone. He approached his task with signature Germanic precision and an uncanny stamina, sometimes conducting dozens of executions in a single day. Fellow Nazi executioners described him as a consummate professional with an unshakable composure. When American forces captured Reichard at the end of the war, he admitted to his role but portrayed himself as an apolitical civil servant, a reluctant cog in the machine. In his mind, he had simply done his duty by following all official state orders, however distasteful. The Americans released Reichard, and he attempted to resume a quiet civilian life. But his reputation, like the bloodstains on the well-worn wooden execution block he'd inherited from his father, would never wash away. He lived out his final years in lonely ignominy, shunned, conflicted, forever bound to his dark past. Reichardt's story marked the end of an era. He represented one of the last true executioners in the medieval mold, a man born to the trade, steeped in clannish tradition, devoted in his own way to the bloody craft. But by the 20th century, the age of the hooded headsman was fading fast. Even Reichard had come to believe in his twilight years that the practice was anachronistic and inhumane. He supported the abolition of capital punishment in Germany after the fall of Nazism, despite his livelihood depending on its continuation. In that sense, he followed the reluctant executioner's arc to its natural end. The details differ, but the themes echo across centuries and borders in the lives of medieval executioners. Men like Sanson, Ascan, and Reichard were united by the uniquely heavy burden they bore in service of the state. They were indispensable but expendable, powerful yet powerless. Though the stereotypical Black Hood has long been retired in much of the modern world, capital punishment itself endures in some places, as do those who administer it. The methods may have changed, but that fundamental tension between law and morality remains. In a sense, the executioner's story is a story of wrestling with society's darkest impulses and the meaning of justice itself. It's a tale of those caught between worlds, reviled but necessary ordinary men who carried out extraordinary and terrible acts. Their lives were a study in contradiction. So when you lie awake at night, troubled by the worries of the world, consider for a moment the inner life of the medieval executioner. His was a world of blood and coin, of power and pain, of purpose and damnation. A grim and lonesome existence, to be sure. Yet someone had to do it, and do it they did with a resolute sense of duty for generations on end. The headsman's burdens may seem a relic of a distant and more brutal time. But is our modern relationship to justice and punishment really so different? Have we progressed as much as we'd like to believe? These were the heavy thoughts that weighed on the mind as the executioner wiped down his blade and retreated to his austere stone chamber. Tomorrow would bring another judgment, another hooded walk to the scaffold, another sober swing of the sword. He would be ready to do what needed to be done. But for now, in the dark still of night, he would try not to dream of sundered necks and crimson stains. He would try to remember that there was still a man beneath the black hood, flawed and weary as any other, but one who bore the weight of a heavy blood-soaked history. Such is the executioner's lot. The kingdom was a brutal place in those days of yore, and no man knew that better than the executioner. While the nobles and clergy retired to their comfortable manors and abbeys, the executioner returned to his Spartan cottage on the outskirts of town, as far removed from respectable society as his grim profession. Yet even in his solitude, the executioner could never fully escape the spectre of death that clung to him like a shadow. It followed him through the muddy streets as widows and orphans hurled rotten fruit and vulgar curses. It seeped into his restless dreams where the faces of the condemned flickered behind his eyelids. In those dreams, the executioner sometimes found himself upon his own scaffold, gazing out at a jeering crowd as another black-hooded figure sharpened his blade. The executioner's only hope for a measure of peace lay in the bottles of wine and ale he could afford with his generous, if blood-soaked salary. With every sip, he sought to drown out the echoes of the dying and quiet the clamoring of his own conscience. By the light of a guttering candle, the executioner might reflect on the twisted path that had led him to this life. Many executioners, after all, hadn't sought out the profession. It had been thrust upon them, whether by birth or circumstance. In France, the office of executing criminals had long been a hereditary position passed down from father to son. The Sanson dynasty of executioners had presided over France's most notable beheadings for centuries. Ever since Charles Sanson first picked up the great sword under Louis XIII in 1622. Unlike the kings they served, the Sanson didn't rule from a gilded palace, but from a far humbler abode in a Paris neighborhood reserved for society's outcasts. There, a young Charles-Henri Sanson had learned the grim robes from his austere father in the 1700s. Theirs was a household where decapitated heads and torture devices were spoken of as casually as the weather. While other fathers passed down wisdom or a family trade, the elder Sanson bequeathed an encyclopedic knowledge of human anatomy to his son. Together they pored over anatomical diagrams of the neck, the spine, the veins and arteries. To deliver a swift and precise death blow, the executioner couldn't merely be strong of arm, but deft in the positioning of the blade with impeccable aim. A botched execution with too many strokes of the axe or sword was regarded as a great disgrace. Under his father's stern tutelage, Charles Henry also learned to speak the lines of ritualized formality as if by rote. In the name of the king you are hereby sentenced to death by beheading. Even in the face of the foulest criminal, the Sanson prided themselves on a certain cold, detached professionalism. An executioner could afford to show neither pity nor pleasure in his bloody task, lest he lose his iron grip on his own sanity. But beneath the elder Sanson's gruff exterior, there were fleeting glimpses of a man burdened by a lifetime of delivering death to the downtrodden. In rare, unguarded moments, he confessed to his son the gnawing guilt and gruesome flashbacks that haunted his twilight years. It was a chilling omen of the inner demons the young Charles-Henri would battle as he, in turn, ascended to the role of France's royal executioner. The training was as much mental as physical, a strict regimen of emotional detachment and unflappable composure. An executioner who wavered or blanched at the sight of blood wouldn't last long in the trade. With practice and time, Charles-Henri learned to don the impassive mask expected of his station. Yet, try as he might, he could never fully harden his heart to the suffering he inflicted. Even the most stoic of executioners were still made of mortal flesh and blood, with their own fears and frailties simmering beneath the surface. Charles Henry's father hadn't lived to see his son's inner turmoil reach its apex when the reign of terror plunged Paris into an unprecedented frenzy of bloodletting. When the revolution's dreaded guillotine began claiming victim after victim, from deposed royals to hapless peasants, the younger Sanson found himself presiding over a veritable conveyor belt of carnage. As the severed heads piled up in gruesome mounds and the cobblestones ran red, even a veteran executioner like Charles Henry struggled to keep his composure through the sheer volume and grisly repetition of the purge. By day, his face was an unreadable mask as he robotically pulled the lever, watching the razor-sharp blade descend with a terminal slice and thud. But by night, the terrors of his work caught up to him, sending him into shaking fits and waking nightmares. It was a trauma that would haunt Charles Henry for the rest of his days, long after the reign of terror had yielded to a more quiet and stable time. In his memoirs, he wrote movingly of his lingering anguish and the heavy conscience he carried to his grave. At night, when I lie down on my pallet, he confessed, all the scenes of horror and carnage that I have witnessed during the day present themselves to my imagination and disturb my repose. Charles Henry was far from the only executioner to feel the weight of his grisly deeds upon his soul. Though they may have been hardened men of steel on the surface, many still grappled with the moral toll of their thankless task. Some sought solace in religion, praying fervently for the salvation of the souls they dispatched. Others, as we've heard, turned to the numbing refuge of drink. But the executioner's plight was often one of isolation, cut off from the comforts and means of coping granted to other men. Even the church, which relied on the headsman to mete out its grim punishments, regarded him with uneasy suspicion. Executioners were forbidden from taking the sacrament, and many a priest doubtless wondered if God's forgiveness extended to professional killers, even those with the law on their side. Thus, while France's executioners may have been indispensable agents of the king's justice, their reward was a lifetime of loneliness and alienation from nearly every corner of society. It was a fate that some bore with grim resignation, others with embittered resentment, but none could truly escape. As the Sanson and scores of other executioner dynasties could attest, once a man had picked up the axe and donned the black hood, he was forever marked by his macabre trade. Long after Charles Henry's tenure ended and the guillotine's thirst was slaked, that stigma would linger. Even as the spectacle of public executions lost favor and the executioner's hood was finally laid down, the shadow it cast over its wearer remained. In a world that increasingly saw capital punishment as a distasteful relic, the executioner became a pariah, shunned for a role that society demanded but couldn't bear to face. The legacy of men like Charles Henry Son was one forever stained by blood and controversy. Their lives were a strange tightrope between duty and damnation, sin and social necessity, a moral quandary as unsettling as the executions they performed. In their complex tale, we find an unsettling mirror held up to society itself and its own conflicted relationship with violence, vengeance, and the value of a human soul. The executioner's hood may be gathering dust, but the questions it raised still loom. As restless as his tormented spirit, the looming spectre of death was a constant companion to all in the medieval era. No one knew this better than the town executioner, whose grim task it was to dispense the ultimate punishment to the condemned. To peer back through the centuries at these dark figures is to gaze into a cracked and haunting mirror, one that reflects the harshest contours of the human soul. Our story begins with a hooded man, his face lined with the weight of his duties, ascending a rickety wooden platform. Below him, a rapt crowd jostles for a better view, their voices rising in a mix of anticipation and dread. They have come to witness the execution of a notorious highwayman, a man whose deeds have long terrorized the roads and byways of the land. The executioner takes his position beside the block, his practiced hands adjusting the blade of his heavy axe. He is a man apart, clad in the somber garb of his trade. A dark tunic and trousers adorned only by the emblem of the city he serves. His manner is one of grim professionalism, honed by years of escorting the doomed to the brink of eternity. As the prisoner is led forth, the crowd falls silent. The condemned man's face is pale but resolute, his lips moving in a final prayer. He kneels, placing his head upon the stained wood of the block. The executioner raises his axe, the blade gleaming dully in the wan sunlight. For a heartbeat, all is still. Then, with a whoo of air and a sickening thud, it is done. As the executioner solemnly lifts the severed head for the crowd to see, a palpable release of tension ripples through the square. Justice in the eyes of the law and the populace has been served. The executioner has played his part as generations of his forebears have done before him in the grim pageant of crime and punishment. But what manner of person could carry out such a brutal task day after day and year after year? What kind of life did these executioners lead, and what toll did their macabre duties take upon their hearts and minds? To answer these questions, we must delve deeper into the shadows of history. For most executioners, theirs was a trade passed down from father to son, a grim inheritance that set them forever apart from their fellow citizens. From a young age, they were apprenticed to a master executioner, learning the techniques of dealing death with a variety of fearsome tools, the axe, the sword, the noose, and more. It was a rigorous and unforgiving education, one that required not only great physical strength and precision, but also a mental fortitude bordering on the inhuman. An executioner had to learn to steel himself against the screams and pleas of the condemned, to carry out his duties with a kind of detached professionalism. Part of this training involved a deep study of human anatomy, a necessary precursor to ensuring a swift and relatively painless death for those sentenced to die. A skilled executioner could sever a head with a single blow or snap a neck with a deft twist of the rope. He took pride in his ability to minimize suffering, even as he ended lives. But no amount of training could fully prepare an executioner for the weight of his grisly duties. To kill on command, day after day, exacts a heavy toll on the mind and spirit. Many executioners turn to drink to dull the pain, losing themselves in the oblivion of the bottle. Others retreated into grim solitude, shunned by a society that feared and reviled them, even as it relied upon their services. It was a lonely and harrowing existence to be forever balanced on the knife's edge between life and death. An executioner walked in the shadowlands, estranged from the world of the living, but not yet consigned to the realm of the dead. His was a twilight world forever tainted by the blood he spilled in the name of justice. And yet even within this bleak landscape, there were moments of humanity, glimmers of light amidst the pervading darkness. In the quiet hours before a public execution, As the town square slowly filled with onlookers, the executioner would often visit the condemned in their cell, offering what small comfort he could. Sometimes it was a drink of water or a morsel of bread. Other times it was a prayer or a gentle word, a reassurance that the end would be quick and clean. These small acts of kindness were a lifeline for the doomed, a final touch of human warmth before the axe fell. For all the gruesomeness of his trade, the executioner was not a cruel man by nature. He was a professional tasked with a necessary but awful duty. In his own way, he sought to bring a measure of dignity and solace to those he was charged with dispatching from this life. Perhaps that is why, despite the fear and loathing they inspired, executioners were also figures of dark fascination for the medieval public. Their lives were shrouded in mystery and legend, their personas a source of grim tales and whispered rumors. Some said that an executioner possessed supernatural powers, that he could communicate with the dead or cast curses upon the living. Others claimed that a talisman crafted from a hanging rope or a shard of a blood-stained axe could ward off evil or cure disease. A few enterprising executioners even found ways to profit from these superstitions, hawking grisly souvenirs to those with a taste for the macabre. But for most executioners, the weight of their chosen profession was a burden to be endured, not celebrated. They lived their lives in the long shadow of the scaffold, forever marked by the dark deeds they committed in the name of king and country. And yet, even the most hardened of executioners could not fully escape the toll of their grim trade. In the dark of the night, when the crowds had dispersed and the blood had been washed away, the memories of the condemned would come flooding back. The pleas for mercy, the looks of terror, the awful finality of the blade's fall. Some executioners sought solace in religion, praying for the souls of those they had dispatched and for the salvation of their own troubled spirits. Others retreated into themselves, erecting high walls around their hearts and minds to keep out the nightmares, but none could entirely escape the spectre of death that clung to them like a shroud. In the end, the executioner's life was one of bleak necessity, a vital but horrifying cog in the machinery of medieval justice. They were the last faces the condemned would ever see, the dealers of society's harshest and most irreversible punishment. And yet, for all the darkness and brutality that attended their profession, executioners were also human beings, flawed, conflicted, and forever burdened by the weight of their grim duties. To remember them is to gaze unflinchingly at the darkest recesses of our shared history, and to ponder the toll that violence and retribution exact on the human soul. As we trace the executioner's path through the shadows of the past, we are reminded of the thin line that separates justice from vengeance and the high price paid by those tasked with walking that line. In the end, the executioner's story is a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the darkness that lurks within the human heart, and of the steep cost of keeping that darkness at bay. An instructive example of this complex dynamic can be found in the life of Charles Henri Sanson, a famed executioner who plied his trade in Paris during the tumultuous years of the French Revolution. Born into a dynasty of executioners that stretched back to the 1600s, Sanson was a man steeped in the grim traditions of his forebears. From a young age, he was groomed to take up the family mantle, learning the dark arts of the blade and the noose at the knee of his father. By the time he came of age, Sanson was a master of his craft, a grim virtuoso in the theatre of public execution. But for all his skill and pedigree, Sanson was not immune to the toll of his chosen trade. In his memoirs, penned in the waning years of his life, he speaks of the heavy burden of his work, the constant weight of death upon his shoulders. It is a terrible thing, he wrote, to hold the power of life and death in one's hands, to be the instrument of the law's ultimate sanction. It is a responsibility that never grows easier, no matter how many times one performs the act, and perform it. He did with a grim efficiency that made him one of the most prolific executioners in French history. Over the course of his long career, Sanson personally dispatched nearly 3,000 souls to the next world, from common thieves and murderers to aristocrats and royalty. His most infamous moment came in January of 1793 when he presided over the execution of King Louis V himself. It was a moment fraught with danger and historical import, as the fate of a nation hung in the balance. Sanson, ever the consummate professional, carried out his duties with a cool precision, severing the monarch's head with a single stroke of the blade. But even in this moment of grim triumph, Sanson was haunted by the weight of his actions. In his memoirs, he speaks of the strange intimacy of the act, the feeling of the king's lifeblood spattering his face and hands. In that instant, he wrote, "I felt the full burden of my office, the awful responsibility of being the one to end the life of God's anointed sovereign." It was a burden that would stay with Samson for the rest of his days, even as he continued to ply his trade through the bloody years of the Reign of Terror. With each passing execution, each fall of the blade, he felt himself slipping further into the abyss, his soul stained by the blood of the condemned. And yet, even in his darkest moments, Sanson clung to a grim sense of professional pride, a belief in the necessity of his work. He saw himself as an instrument of justice, a bulwark against the chaos and lawlessness that threatened to engulf the land. In his own mind, he was a servant of the greater good, even if that service required him to wade through an ocean of blood and suffering. It was a delicate balance, one that required a constant negotiation between his sense of duty and the toll it exacted on his soul. In the end, Samson's story is a testament to the strange and complex psychology of the executioner. The mental and emotional contortions required to carry out such a grim and weighty task. It is a reminder that even those who deal in death are not immune to its ravages, that the act of killing, even in the name of justice, leaves an indelible mark on the psyche. And yet, for all the darkness and horror that attended his profession, Sanson remained a figure of grim fascination. For the people of his time, his name was whispered in taverns and marketplaces, his deeds the stuff of grisly legend. In a strange way, he came to embody the savage contradictions of the era, the tension between the lofty ideals of the Enlightenment and the brutal realities of the revolutionary moment. As we look back on Sanson's life from the distance of centuries, it is easy to view him as a monster, a cold-blooded killer who dispatched human lives with all the detachment of a butcher slaughtering cattle. But to do so is to ignore the complex web of duty, tradition, and necessity that bound him to his grim trade. In the end, Sanson was a product of his time and place, a man tasked with carrying out the darkest of society's impulses. That he did so with a measure of skill and professionalism is a testament not to his inhumanity, but to his resilience in the face of unimaginable horror. And yet, Even as we ponder the grim necessity of his work, we cannot help but shudder at the toll it must have taken on his soul. To live in the constant shadow of death, to be forever stained by the blood of the condemned, it is a fate that few would choose and fewer still could bear. As the sun sets on another day, and the last of the crowd disperses from the place of execution, we are left to contemplate the strange and haunting figure of the executioner. He is a reminder of the savagery that lurks within the human heart, and of the high price we pay to keep that savagery in check. But he is also a testament to the enduring resilience of the human spirit, to our ability to carry on in the face of even the darkest of circumstances. In his own grim way, the executioner is a guardian of order, a bulwark against the chaos that ever threatens to engulf us. And so we remember him not with love or admiration, but with a kind of somber respect for the weight he carried, for the sacrifices he made, and for the strange and terrible role he played in the drama of human history. As we drift off to sleep, our minds heavy with the weight of these dark reflections, we can take solace in the knowledge that we live in a world that has largely moved beyond the need for such grim services. The days of the public execution of the hooded man with the axe are long behind us. But even as we celebrate this progress, we would do well to remember the lessons of the executioner's tale, the fragility of justice, the high cost of retribution, and the enduring power of the human spirit to endure even the darkest of trials. In the end, the executioner's story is our story, a reminder of how far we have come and of how far we still have to go in our long and uneven march towards a more just and humane world. It is a tale that haunts and instructs us even as it fades into the mists of history. So let us rest now, secure in the knowledge that the executioner's grim vigil has ended, and that a new day dawns upon a world forever changed by his dark and weighty deeds. And let us carry with us the memory of his sacrifice as we work to build a future in which such sacrifices are no longer required. For in the end, the executioner's legacy is not one of death and despair, but of the enduring resilience of the human spirit, a spirit that can endure even the darkest of nights and emerge into the light of a new and better dawn. The executioner's paradox was a strange and tragic one. These men, for they were nearly always men, were both essential and reviled in medieval society. They served as the final instruments of the law, carrying out the ultimate punishment on the guilty. Yet in doing so, they were seen as tainted, doomed to live on the fringes of respectable society. It's hard for us to imagine today, but try to picture the lonely, conflicted life of a medieval executioner. By day, he dealt out death, his hands stained red with the blood of the condemned. He was there on the scaffold, presiding over the grim spectacle of public executions. With a solemn nod of his hooded head, he would signal the drums to stop, the crowd to fall silent, and then with a swift practice stroke of his sword, or a hard pull on the rope, he would send another soul to face the final judgment. But as much as the executioner was needed, he was never truly accepted. To the pious and superstitious medieval mind, there was something unholy about a man who killed for a living, even if it was sanctioned by the law. Executioners were often forced to live on the outskirts of town in small, dark houses away from respectable folk. They were barred from most social gatherings and celebrations. Even stepping foot in a church was forbidden to them. Many executioners grappled with the weight of their grim duties. Certainly some were hardened men who took a cruel satisfaction in their work, but others were more conflicted, struggling to reconcile their role with their conscience. It was a heavy burden to bear, knowing that your hands were destined to end the lives of so many, even if they were criminals condemned by the courts. This psychological toll could manifest in different ways. Some executioners turned to drink, drowning their demons in ale and wine. There are tales of executioners who would imbibe to the point of near stupor before every execution, so that their hands wouldn't shake and they could pretend not to hear the screams. For them, alcohol was the only balm for a tortured soul. Others fell into deep melancholy, growing ever more sullen and withdrawn. They would go about their days in a grim stupor, speaking to no one, consumed by the dark thoughts in their head. There were even stories of executioners who, driven mad by guilt and isolation, took their own lives, hanging themselves from the very gallows where they had sent so many to die. And yet, for all the ostracization they faced, executioners were not entirely powerless. In fact, they could wield a strange sort of authority in medieval society. After all, they were the ones trusted to carry out the ultimate sanction of the law. Even the mightiest, noble, or wealthiest merchant had a reason to fear the executioner's blade. Some executioners leveraged this unique position for their own gain. They would charge money for a swift and painless death, a final mercy for those who could afford it. Others marketed grim souvenirs from the execution site: scraps of the rope, locks of the dead man's hair, vials allegedly filled with blood. For the superstitious masses, these were powerful talismans imbued with the fearsomeness of the execution. And in certain cases, executioners could even rise to a form of prominence themselves. Take, for example, the case of one executioner in Nuremberg, Germany, a man by the name of Franz Schmidt. Active in the late 1500s, Schmidt presided over hundreds of executions, beheadings, and acts of torture. But unlike many of his counterparts, Schmidt shrewdly leveraged his position. He kept meticulous records of his work, detailing each execution in a personal journal that survives to this day. And over decades of service, he amassed a small fortune in payments for his deadly duties. With that money, Schmidt made a most unlikely social climb. He purchased a lavish home in the heart of Nuremberg, a grand stone affair that sent tongues wagging amongst the city's elite. He even managed to secure special dispensations to attend church services and social gatherings normally denied to one of his profession. For a time, in defiance of all custom, Franz Schmidt had improbably risen to join the ranks of Nuremberg's most prominent citizens. But Schmidt's story is a rare exception. Far more common was the executioner who lived and died in lonely ignominy, forever burdened by his dark trade. For most of these men, the only escape from their grim lot was the grave. They would pass their trade down to their sons, as it had been passed to them, an inheritance of blood and shame. In time, the profession of the medieval executioner would fade away, rendered obsolete by changing attitudes and technologies. The spectacle of public beheadings and hangings slowly vanished from town squares across Europe. New methods of capital punishment like the guillotine and later the electric chair displaced the hooded headsman with his axe and sword. But there is one final medieval executioner whose story deserves telling. A man who plied his trade well into the 20th century. His name was Johann Reichardt, and for nearly 4 decades he served as the official executioner of Bavaria Estate in southern Germany. Reichardt lived a strange double life. Outwardly, he was a mild-mannered family man and photography enthusiast, but when duty called, he would don his black hood and carry out his deadly work with cold precision. Over the course of his career, Reichardt executed more than 3,000 people, including numerous Nazi war criminals sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trials. Despite the scale of death he dealt, Reichardt maintained he was no monster, but a professional dutifully carrying out the orders of the state. Even still, he was heavily burdened by his work, sinking into depression and alcoholism in his later years. Johann Reichardt would be the last prominent executioner in German history. After the abolition of capital punishment in West Germany in 1949, he faded into obscurity. His story a final dark epilogue to a centuries-long tradition. And so the medieval executioner passed into the pages of history. Today we look back on that hooded figure as a grim relic of a more barbaric time. And yet if we peer deeper into his story, we might just find a more complex truth. For in many ways, the medieval executioner occupied a unique space between light and shadow, between justice and cruelty, between duty and disgrace. He was a man who carried out brutal acts, yet was still undeniably human, burdened with a guilt and loneliness few of us can ever truly comprehend. To walk a mile in his heavy black boots is to confront some of the darkest aspects of our own history. It is to grapple with questions of morality and mortality that still haunt us to this day, even if the hooded headsman no longer stalks our town squares. And so as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for the medieval executioner, that grim and tragic figure who dealt out death in the name of the law. May we ponder his story with empathy and solemnity, and may we hope that his kind will never walk among us again. But for now, it is time to let those dark tales recede into the depths of history. Time to let our minds quiet and our breathing slow. The night is soft around you, gentle and welcoming, inviting you to surrender to its embrace. So let your eyes grow heavy, and let my words become a soothing hum, fading into the warm darkness of sleep. Rest now, dear listener, and may your dreams be untroubled by the shadows of the past. Good night. The flickering torch cast eerie shadows on the executioner's weathered face as he stood stoically in the pre-dawn gloom. An icy breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and decaying straw, but he barely noticed. His mind was fixed on the grim task ahead. With methodical focus, he began his preparations. The heavy oak worked groaned as he laid out his tools. The great axe head, its edges honed to gleaming sharpness, the thick hemp rope, coarse and unyielding, and the sword, elegant yet deadly, entrusted to him by the Duke himself for noble beheadings. Each instrument carefully inspected and blessed with a whispered prayer. But it was more than mere weaponry that the executioner readied that chill morning. He steeled himself mentally and emotionally for the bloody work to come. A deep breath to center his thoughts, a sip of strong ale to fortify his spirit and steady his hands. For though he had presided over countless tortures and executions, it was never a deed he took lightly. The executioner knew he was both reviled and feared, a pariah forced to live on the outskirts of town, shunned by the very society he served. Cruel irony for one tasked with the solemn role of carrying out justice. But such was his birthright and duty, skills passed down through generations. His father had placed the axe in his hands at the tender age of 12, the first tendrils of his dark legacy. Under his father's strict tutelage, he learned the precision of a neck-breaking drop, the angle of a severing blow, the signs of a condemned soul's merciful expiry. But no amount of training could inure him to the pleading eyes, the hysterical sobs, the pungent odor of voided bowels. Each ashen face and spurt of crimson blood seared into memory. These spectres revisited the executioner's rare dreams and lurked at the edges of his waking thoughts. A heaviness that could never be fully lifted even in times of rest. It was in those fleeting moments between trials and sentences that he felt most acutely alone, isolated by the burdens of his macabre betrayed. He would walk the town square at dusk after the crowds had dispersed, and the blood had been scrubbed from the cobblestones, hoping to hear snatches of mundane conversation, talk of harvest yields, childhood games, or a hearty meal. But voices would drop to furtive whispers as he passed. Fearful sideways glances cast his way. Some would frantically make the evil eye sign or clutch a protective talisman. The executioner was used to this reaction, but it stung nonetheless. A reminder that despite his vital role, he would forever be an outsider, respected for his power over life and death, but never accepted the price of being the hand of justice in an often merciless time. As he gathered up the last of his tools in the somber dawn light, the executioner's thoughts drifted to the day ahead, more traitors' heads to sever, more thieves' necks to snap. Another small piece of his soul surrendered to the chopping block of duty. With a heavy sigh, he stepped out to face the waiting crowds, knowing that whatever victories the law might claim, a part of him would always remain in the shadows. The life of a medieval executioner was by any measure a brutal and unforgiving one. To fully understand the weight they carried and the harsh realities they faced, we must peer deeper into their origins, training, and day-to-day existence. What's more, by profiling some of the prominent executioners throughout history, we can gain a more human glimpse into the men behind the hoods and axes. Take, for example, Charles Henri Sanson, the royal executioner of Paris in the late 18th century. Born in 1739 to a long line of state executioners stretching back to the 1600s, Sanson was the fourth in his family to hold the title of Monsieur de Parare, a Gentile euphemism for his grim office. From a young age, Sanson was groomed to follow in his forefathers' footsteps. While other children played in the sunlit streets of the city, he was learning the grim tools of the trade in shadowed chambers. His education was one of death. The precise angle needed to cleanly sever a head, the correct portion of body weight to ensure a swift hanging, the vital signs of a departed soul. But Sanson was no unthinking brute or bloodthirsty sadist. By all accounts, he was an intelligent, sensitive man who struggled with the moral implications of his work. In his memoirs, he wrote of the dreadful anxiety he felt before each execution and the state of violent emotion that followed. It was a heavy psychic toll exacted by his duties, and those duties were manifold and morbid. Over his long career, Sanson personally dispatched nearly 3,000 condemned souls to their maker. Murderers and thieves, forgers and rebels, their blood flowed like a dark river through the years of his service, but no execution would test Sanson's resolve more than that of the deposed King Louis XVI himself. On a frigid January morning in 1793, Sanson found himself face to face with the former monarch atop the scaffold. In that tense moment, as he gazed into the king's resigned eyes and raised his blade, one can only imagine the tempest of emotions that roared within him. Here was the divine ruler of France, laid low and entrusted to the executioner's hand by the implacable forces of revolution. With a swift, sure stroke, it was done. As he held aloft the king's severed head to the roaring crowd, Sanson became more than a mere executioner. He was now an avatar of the people's will, a grim symbol of the new order rising from the blood-soaked cobblestones, a task he never sought, but one thrust upon him by the tides of history. In the turbulent years that followed, as the revolution consumed its own, and the guillotine's appetite grew ravenous, Sanson struggled to reconcile his sworn duty with his mounting distaste for the work. Privately, he began to question the ease with which the revolutionaries dispatched their enemies to the blade, and the unthinking bloodlust of the mob. But ever the professional, he carried on presiding over the executions of once powerful nobles and former allies of the revolution alike. Marie-Antoinette, Danton, Robespierre, their deaths were all meted out by his hand, even as his spirit grew heavy with the weight of so much carnage. It was a burden he would bear for the rest of his days. Even after retiring and passing on his grim mantle to his son Henri, the elder son withdrew from public life, seeking solace in quiet contemplation and the writing of his memoirs. But the spectre of the guillotine and the faces of the condemned were never far from his thoughts. In the end, Charles Henri Sanson embodied the brutal paradox of the executioner's life. A man of moral complexity and human frailty, forced to carry out inhuman acts in the name of justice. His story is a testament to the toll such a grim responsibility exacts on the soul, and a window into the harsh realities faced by those who wielded the blade in medieval and early modern times. But not all executioners were as introspective or haunted as Sanson. Some, like the Yorkshire hangman Thomas Assin, found shrewd ways to turn their macabre reputation to their advantage. Assin, who plied his trade in the late 1500s, was known as much for his entrepreneurial zeal as his skill with a noose. Recognizing the fearful fascination many held for his profession, Ascan began to market grim souvenirs and dubious cures on the side. He would sell lengths of used hanging rope to superstitious villagers who believed that a segment of the fatal hemp could ward off evil spirits or cure various ailments. Even more audaciously, Arsène bottled and sold his own bathwater, claiming it had holy powers to heal the sick. Gullible peasants and merchants enthralled to the hangman's sinister aura would pay handsomely for a chance to imbibe the murky liquid or daub it on their afflicted limbs. Through this morbid entrepreneurship, Ascan was able to amass a tidy fortune to complement his executioner's salary. It was a rare instance of an executioner leveraging his grim trade for profit and a degree of financial security. But it also speaks to the strange, double-edged nature of the executioner's reputation. On one hand, men like Ascan and Sanson were reviled and feared as harbingers of death. Their very presence enough to make good folk recoil or ward themselves with superstitious gestures. They were forced to live on the fringes of society in the literal and figurative shadows of the gallows. But on the other hand, the executioner was also a figure of morbid fascination and even grudging respect. Their intimate knowledge of death and their unflinching ability to dispatch it gave them an aura of dark power and mystery. It was this perverse allure that Ascan so shrewdly exploited with his gruesome wares. This paradox, the executioner, as both necessary evil and fearsome authority, was a defining feature of the profession in medieval times. For while they were undeniably brutal men doing bloody work, they were also indispensable agents of the state and the social order. In an age where public executions were as much about maintaining control as serving justice, the executioner was the ultimate enforcer of the law. His grim visage on the scaffold or at the chopping block was a potent symbol of the consequences of transgression and the power of the ruling class. As such, executioners were both employed and empowered by the very society that shunned them. It's a strange and contradictory existence, captured vividly in the words of the British author and historian Alison Weir, writing about the life of a typical medieval executioner. He was a man despised and avoided, yet invested with the authority of life and death over his fellow creatures, a walking embodiment of mortality and the omnipotence of the law. This duality, the reviled pariah wielding the power of life and death, goes a long way towards explaining the executioner's unique and unenviable place in medieval society. They were the ultimate outsiders, cut off from the warmth of human connection and common comfort. But they were also dark pillars of the established order, their fearsome presence necessary to uphold the king's peace. It was a role that exacted a heavy toll in body and soul. The back-breaking labor of erecting gibbets, the bone-jarring impact of each beheading stroke, the stench of blood and bowels that clung to their clothes. These were just the physical hardships of the executioner's trade, but it was the mental and emotional anguish that proved even more corrosive over time. Rare was the executioner who did not turn to drink to dull the pain of his dark deeds. Many fell into deep melancholy or fits of rage, their minds unhinged by proximity to so much suffering and death. For how could any man, no matter how stout of heart, remain unaffected by such unrelenting darkness, to kill again and again, to witness the final throes and terrors of the condemned, to bear their desperate pleas and dying curses? It would scar the hardiest of souls. And yet, for generations of executioners like Sanson and Ascan, this was their inescapable fate. Born into a dynasty of death, schooled in the grim arts of ending life, and charged with carrying out the implacable decrees of law and crown. They were prisoners of their dark inheritance, condemned to a life soaked in blood and shunned by their fellow man. It is perhaps fitting then that the golden age of the executioner began to fade in the 1700s and 1800s as the medieval world order gave way to the modern age. The rise of Enlightenment ideals, with their emphasis on human dignity and reason, made the brutal public spectacle of execution seem increasingly barbaric and outdated. At the same time, new methods of capital punishment like the guillotine and later the electric chair began to supplant the traditional tools of the executioner's trade. These technological innovations made death quicker, more efficient, and less overtly bloody, a stark contrast to the protracted agonies of the medieval scaffold. As public tastes and sensibilities changed, the executioner's once fearsome aura began to dissipate. Where once they were dark agents of order and authority, they came to be seen as cruel anachronisms, relics of a more brutal age. The hooded figure with an axe, once a potent symbol of state power, became a cartoonish cliché, a source of gallows humor rather than genuine fear. This decline is poignantly captured in the story of Johann Reichardt, Bavaria's last state executioner. A man born into the twilight of his grim profession, Reichardt bore witness to the final spasms of capital punishment in Germany. During the dark years of Nazi rule, Reichardt found himself presiding over the secret executions of political prisoners and dissident. In a twist of fate, he was forced to dispatch the very men who had once employed him as the crumbling regime sought to hide evidence of its atrocities in the war's chaotic final days. It was a grim epilogue to centuries of brutal tradition, the executioner as an accessory to the worst excesses of tyranny and oppression. And with the fall of the Third Reich and the abolition of capital punishment in West Germany, Reichardt and his ilk faded into ignominious obscurity. In the end, the medieval executioner stands as a haunting reminder of the cruelty and darkness that once held sway in human affairs, a figure both necessary and reviled, empowered and outcast. He embodied the brutal contradictions of an age when life was cheap and death was ever present. Their stories, from the anguished confessions of Charles Oriens to the gallows humour of Thomas Askin, offer a glimpse into the harsh realities of a world where justice was swift, merciless and drenched in blood. A world where the executioner was both the instrument of order and a symbol of its most primal brutality. And while we may recoil at their grim trade and the casual cruelty of their era, we cannot help but feel a twinge of fascination and even pity for these dark souls. For they were in the end as much victims of their time and station as the condemned wretches they dispatched to the next world. In the sombre words of Charles Henri's son himself, reflecting on a life steeped in death, "I have killed, it is true, but it was not of my own volition. I have always detested my horrible profession, but I had to carry out my orders. It is a sentiment that echoes across the centuries, a reminder of the heavy toll exacted on those who served as the brutal hand of justice in a merciless age. And as we consign the medieval executioner to the shadows of history, we are left to ponder the darkness that once dwelt in the human heart, and the hard-won progress that has brought us to a more enlightened, if still imperfect, present. For while the hooded figure with the axe may be gone, the spectre of cruelty and the thirst for retribution still linger in our world. It is up to us to confront these dark impulses with the light of compassion and reason, to remember the brutal past while striving for a more just and humane future. And so as we lay our heads down to rest, let us spare a thought for the medieval executioner, that grim and tragic figure who once loomed so large in the nightmares of our ancestors. May their dark legacy serve as a reminder of how far we have come and how far we still have to go in the unending quest for justice and human dignity. Content warning. This script contains descriptions of medieval torture and violence. As the executioner's heavy footsteps echo across the town square, the murmuring crowd falls silent. A palpable tension hangs in the air, mingling with the acrid scent of smoke from the sputtering torches. The hooded figure ascends the wooden platform, his eyes fixed on the condemned man kneeling before the block. With a solemn nod, he raises his gleaming axe high overhead, poised to deliver the final blow. Such grim scenes played out countless times across medieval Europe, with the executioner serving as the dark hand of justice. These sombre men, often born into the profession and trained from a young age, wielded tremendous power over life and death. Yet for all their fearsome reputation and gruesome duties, the executioners themselves led a harsh, lonely existence on the fringes of society. Imagine, if you will, the life of a typical medieval executioner. Picture a child barely old enough to lift a sword, learning the grisly tools of his inherited trade at his father's knee. He must study the secrets of the swift, precise blow that separates head from body. He commits to memory the placements of vital arteries and organs to ensure his victims do not suffer unduly. The lessons are as much psychological as physical. He steels himself against the screams, the spurting blood, the convulsing limbs. It is a heavy burden to place on such small shoulders. As an adult, the executioner's life is one of strict routine and discipline. He rises before dawn to prepare for the day ahead, his rough hands methodically sharpening blades, checking ropes for fraying, and laying out his black hood and gloves. There is a ritual to it, a silent meditation before the butchery to come. His duties are manifold and grim. On some days he must mete out public torches as punishment for lesser crimes, a flogging at the whipping post, or perhaps the removal of a pickpocket's hand. The crowds jeer and throw refuse, reviling him even as they eagerly watch the sentence carried out. But it is the executions themselves that are his prime domain. Whether it be a noble beheaded for treason or a peasant hanged for murder, he is the one constant presence on the scaffold. With practiced movements, he guides the condemned into position, offers a final prayer or comforting word. Then, in one swift motion, it is over. Another soul dispatched to the hereafter. He cleans his blade on a scrap of cloth and prepares for the next. It is a strange dichotomy to hold such power over fate, yet be so despised and shunned. The executioner and his family are forced to live on the outskirts of town, forbidden from most trades and unwelcome in polite society. Never mind that he serves a vital role, that he is an extension of the same law that keeps the peace. To the eyes of the public, he is death itself, a spectre in their midst. Many buckle under the strain of this isolation, taking solace in the bottom of a bottle or retreating into embittered solitude, but a rare few manage to turn their grim reputation to their advantage. Consider the clever schemes of Thomas Ascarne, a 16th century Yorkshire hangman who secretly sold bits of his hanging ropes as talismans against sickness and ill fortune. He even marketed vials of his bath water as a holy elixir, exploit the morbid fascination and fear his profession engendered. Through such cunning, he amassed a small fortune to pass down to his apprentice son. But Ascarne is more exception than rule. For most executioners, it was a life in the shadows, forever stigmatized, forever chained to the heavy weight of their gruesome calling. Put yourself in their worn, blood-spattered boots for a moment. Imagine having your life's purpose be to end the lives of others. Envision the nightmares, the faces of the dead forever etched behind your eyelids. It is little wonder so many went mad or took their own lives. There were some who tried to find meaning or redemption in the role. Charles Henri, the royal executioner of Paris during the French Revolution, was one such man. Born into a dynasty of state executioners stretching back to the 1600s. Sanson was a true professional who took pride in his work, but he was no monster. He studied anatomy obsessively to ensure his victims died as quickly as possible. When duty compelled him to execute the deposed King Louis himself, he agonized over it and ultimately left the trade a few short years later. But even for the Sanson of the profession, the winds of progress eventually swept the executioners into obsolescence. As the Enlightenment dawned and public sentiment shifted, the appetite for grisly spectacles in the town square waned. By the 1800s, most civic executions had moved behind prison walls with new technologies like the guillotine firing squads, and later electric chairs and lethal injections displacing the hooded headsman. Those who remained were pale shadows of their medieval forebears, shameful relics of a darker, cruel age. Men like Johann Reicher, the last executioner in Bavaria, who secretly dispatched Nazi war criminals with a guillotine in a grimy prison yard in the 1940s. A once feared and powerful figure reduced to a macabre footnote of history. In the end, perhaps the executioners are best remembered not as the inhuman monsters of myth, but as all too mortal men, tasked with a bloody burden they never sought. Certainly, we should feel no great sympathy for those who took perverse pleasure in the role, the cruel and the sadistic. But for the majority who were simply performing a legal, if distasteful, duty, we can feel a twinge of empathy for their harsh, secluded existence. So when next you find your mind wandering to some medieval town square, when you picture the axe rising high and hear the swoosh as it cleaves the air, spare a thought too for the man beneath the hood, a man both necessary and reviled, a dealer of death forever touched by its icy hand, the medieval executioner, a figure of awe, of dread, and of tragedy. The last glimmers of sunlight cast long shadows across the town square as the hooded executioner stepped up onto the wooden platform. An expectant hush fell over the gathered crowd, their faces flickering in the torchlight. They had come to witness the grim spectacle that was as old as civilization itself, the public execution of a condemned criminal. With a solemn nod, the executioner acknowledged the magistrate who stood at the edge of the scaffold, unfurling a scroll to read out the prisoner's final sentence. The words rang out in the evening air, sealing the man's fate. For the heinous crimes of thievery and murder, this man has been sentenced to death by beheading. May God have mercy on his soul. A ragged cheer went up from the crowd as the prisoner was led up onto the platform, his hands bound tightly behind his back. He looked out at the sea of faces with wide, fearful eyes, his final desperate pleas falling on deaf ears. The executioner stepped forward, his black hood obscuring his face as he forced the man to his knees and positioned his neck over the block. In one swift, practiced motion, the executioner raised his gleaming axe high overhead. The blade caught the flickering torchlight as it arced downward, a deadly blur of steel. A sickening thud echoed across the square as it found its mark, followed by an eerie silence. It was done. The executioner had carried out his grim duty once more, as his forefathers had done for generations before him. Such was the lot of the medieval executioner, a life steeped in blood and death, in the strange paradox between justice and cruelty, necessity and brutality. Loathed and shunned by the very society they served, these hooded figures were the dark thread woven through the tapestry of the Middle Ages. Though they have long since faded into the mists of history, the stories of the executioners offer a fascinating, if macabre, glimpse into a world that can sometimes seem unimaginably distant from our own. And yet, in their struggles with morality, mortality, and the often merciless march of justice, perhaps we might recognize shades of our common humanity, whether we care to admit it or not. What sort of person becomes an executioner whose sole purpose is to end the lives of others? It's a question that has echoed down through the centuries. For many, it was simply the family trade, a grim birthright passed down from father to son, an inescapable destiny. Such was the case for Charles Henri, the royal executioner of Paris in the late 18th century. Born into a dynasty of executioners that stretched back to the 1600s, Sansong was the fourth generation to take up the mantle of the High Executioner of Paris. From a young age, he was groomed for his macabre calling, apprenticing under his uncle to learn the meticulous art of dealing death. For Sanson, the training was as much mental as physical. He studied anatomy obsessively, learning precisely where to aim his blade to bring a swift end. But he also had to steel himself for the emotional and psychological toll of the job. Taking a life, even that of a murderer or traitor, is no easy burden to bear. And yet when Sanson stepped up to the scaffold, he did so with a cool professionalism and a certain grim pride in his work. With his austere black coat and powdered wig, he cut an imposing figure as he presided over the bloody business of justice. In his long career as royal executioner, Sanson personally dispatched nearly 3,000 souls to their maker at the behest of the French crown. Among his most famous clients was King Louis V himself, who went bravely to the guillotine during the Reign of Terror in 1793. Though he was no stranger to death, Sanson was said to take no pleasure in his work. He saw it as a solemn duty and a necessary if tragic function of a civilized society. He sought to minimize the suffering of the condemned, priding himself on his clean, sure strokes. And yet, for all his efforts to maintain a certain professional detachment, Sanson was still a man, and one who grappled with the weight of his grim deeds. In his quieter moments, he was known to philosophize about the nature of mortality and justice, and the place of the executioner in the grand scheme of things. In a well-governed state, the executioner's axe is as necessary as the scales of justice, he once mused, perhaps trying to reassure himself as much as anyone. Both are required to maintain order in society. It was cold comfort for a man who had sent so many to their doom. Perhaps seeking some vestige of normalcy, Sanson was known to take solace in the quiet joys of family life when he could. At the end of a long day on the scaffold, he would return to his wife and children, shedding his blood-spattered coat and the spectre of death that clung to him always. But even in those precious moments of domestic tranquility, the ghosts of the executed were never far away. How could they be when he had looked into their eyes in their final moments, when he had felt the shudder of their last breath beneath his hands? In his later years, Sanson began the delicate process of training his own son, Henry, to follow in his footsteps to take up the family mantle and continue the executioner's dynasty. One imagines it was a bittersweet moment for the elder Sanson. What father wishes such a grim fate on his child? And yet, who else could understand the burden he had borne for so long? As he watched his son take his first trembling steps onto the scaffold, did Sanson feel a twinge of regret, a yearning to spare him the lonely path he had walked? Or did he feel a certain melancholy pride, knowing that his legacy would endure, that the Sanson name would continue to be synonymous with death, justice, and the heavy hand of the law? History does not record his innermost thoughts on the matter. But as he looked on, seeing himself in the young man before him, one imagines the old executioner grappled with the same questions that had haunted him throughout his long, blood-soaked career, about fate and free will, about the true cost of upholding order in a chaotic world. Such were the weighty matters that occupied the minds of the executioners, those grim reapers who stood at the crossroads of life and death meting out the ultimate punishment in the name of king and country. Theirs was a strange and terrible calling, one that set them forever apart from their fellow man. And yet, for all the fear and loathing they inspired, the executioners were not always content to dwell in the shadows. Some, like the wise Thomas Ascan, found ways to turn society's morbid fascination with their trade into a tidy profit. Ascan was a hangman in the northern English county of Yorkshire in the late 1500s. He was known for his meticulous attention to detail on the gallows, ensuring that each condemned prisoner met a swift and merciful end. But it was his activities off the scaffold that truly set tongues wagging. With a sly entrepreneurial streak that belied his grim profession, Ascan began peddling a curious array of wares that he claimed could cure all manner of ailments and misfortunes. Among his most prized products were segments of the very ropes he used to dispatch his victims, which he sold as talismans against sickness and bad luck. He also bottled and sold the bath water he used to wash away the grime of his bloody work, marketing it as a potent, holy water with mystical healing properties. Whether born of desperation or a belief in the executioner's supposed occult powers, people flocked to buy Azan's grisly snake oils. Before long, the canny hangman had amassed a small fortune from his morbid side hustle. It was a strange twist of fate, the reviled executioner profiting handsomely from the same people who shunned and feared him. But Ascan was nothing if not adaptable, finding a way to turn even the darkest aspects of his profession to his advantage. Of course, not all executioners were as shrewd or enterprising as Thomas Ascan. For most, their grim trade brought little more than isolation, despair, and the gnawing knowledge that they were forever tainted by the blood on their hands. Though they performed a vital service for crown and community, executioners were universally despised and shunned. They often lived in isolated hakevels on the fringes of town, forbidden from mixing with respectable society. Even their families were tread with the same brush, their children barred from most trades and any hope of a normal life. This ostracism took a heavy toll on the men beneath the hoods. Depression, madness, and crippling alcoholism were common fates for executioners who often sought oblivion at the bottom of a bottle. The trauma of their work, combined with the unrelenting isolation, could break even the hardiest of men. But even in their darkest moments, the executioners held a certain power and mystique. After all, they wielded the ultimate authority over life and death, serving as the brutal enforcers of the law. Even kings and nobles watched their step around the men who could one day hold their fate in blood-stained hands. This strange dichotomy, the pariah who was also feared and respected, was the executioner's lot. They walked a lonely road, forever balanced between the worlds of the living and the dead, the reviled and the necessary. It was a heavy burden, one that left deep scars on even the most stoic of souls. And yet, for all their suffering and sacrifice, the executioners were destined to fade into ignominy. As the centuries wore on and the appetites for blood and brutality waned, these grim figures became little more than historical footnotes, shadowy spectres from a darker age. By the 1700s and 1800s, public executions were falling out of favor across Europe and the Americas. The spectacle of the scaffold, once a staple of the town square, was increasingly seen as a barbaric relic of a less enlightened time. Governments began to consider more humane methods of capital punishment, like the guillotine, firing squad, and later the electric chair and lethal injection. With each passing decade, the executioner's stock fell further. These once feared and respected figures were now seen as little more than grubby anachronisms. Their fearsome mystique long faded, many found themselves out of work. Their dark talents no longer required by a society that had moved on. The story of Johann Reichart, the last executioner of Bavaria, is a poignant symbol of this decline. In the early 20th century, Reichart presided over his craft with the same meticulous dedication as his forebears. He took great pride in his work, insisting that each execution be carried out with precision and dignity. Even during the dark days of Nazi rule in the 1940s, Reichart stoically went about his business, dispatching the enemies of the Reich with his usual icy professionalism. He never let his personal feelings intrude on his work, even as he watched Germany descend into the abyss. But when the war ended and the full extent of the Nazis' crimes came to light, Reichart found himself a pariah once more. The Allies, disgusted by the executioner's complicity with the regime, barred him from plying his trade. He spent his final years in obscurity and disgrace, a relic of a time that many wish to forget. Johann Reichardt's story is a fitting coda to the long blood-stained history of the executioners. These once mighty figures who had struck fear into the hearts of commoners and kings alike had been reduced to little more than shameful reminders of a barbaric past. The world had moved on, leaving them to fade into the shadows of history. And yet, even as the executioners vanished from view, the spectre of their dark trade lingered. For as long as there has been law, there has been punishment, and the need for someone to mete out the ultimate sanction. Whether by axe and rope or needle and syringe, the grim work of the executioner endures, an eternal testament to the darkest impulses of human justice. As we look back on the lives of these hooded figures, it's easy to view them as little more than monsters or villains, the brutal faces of a cruel and unforgiving world. But to do so is to ignore the complex tapestry of their existence, the heavy burdens they bore in service to crown and community. Theirs was a life of isolation and despair, forever balanced between necessity and brutality. They were the unwilling avatars of justice in an age when justice was often synonymous with vengeance and blood. In their stories, we catch a glimpse of the strange paradoxes of power and punishment that have echoed down through the ages. And though the executioners have long since vanished into the mists of history, their legacy endures as a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurks at the edges of human civilization. In their tortured souls and blood-stained hands we see reflected the eternal struggle between order and chaos, mercy and retribution. So perhaps as we consign these grim figures to the shadows of the past, we would do well to remember the burdens they bore on behalf of a society that reviled them. Theirs was a terrible calling, a life steeped in death and despair, but one that holds up a mirror to the darkest recesses of the human soul. And in that reflection, if we look closely enough, we may just catch a glimpse of ourselves and the uneasy knowledge that the line between justice and cruelty is often far thinner than we would like to believe. It's a sobering thought, one that echoes down through the centuries, from the blood-soaked scaffold to the sterile execution chamber. For in the end, the story of the executioners is not just a tale of a bygone age, but a dark thread woven through the very fabric of human history. It speaks to the eternal dance between civilization and savagery, the price we are willing to pay for order in a chaotic world. And though we may recoil from the barbarity of the past, we cannot escape the long shadow it casts over our present. For as long as there is law, there will be punishment, and someone tasked with carrying out the grim work of justice. It's a heavy legacy, one that weighs on us all, whether we wield the axe or simply turn a blind eye to the blood spilled in our name. In the tortured lives of the executioners, we see the reflection of our own struggles with morality and mortality, the price of our uneasy compact with the forces of order and retribution. And so as we consign these dark figures to history's dustbin, let us pause to ponder the burdens they bore and the lessons they leave behind. For in the end, their story is not just theirs, but ours, a reminder of the darkness that dwells within us all, and the eternal struggle to balance the scales of justice in an often merciless world. As the last echoes of the executioner's tale fade into silence, we are left to grapple with these weighty questions in the quiet of our own hearts. And though the answers may be elusive, the asking is its own form of reckoning, a chance to confront the shadows that lurk within and without. For in the end, the story of the executioners is a mirror held up to the human condition, a reflection of our darkest impulses and our noblest ideals. And in that reflection, we may just find a glimmer of understanding, a chance for empathy and grace in a world that so often seems to have little of either. So let us remember the executioners not as monsters or villains, but as fallible, tortured souls forever trapped between the forces of light and darkness. And in remembering, let us strive to build a world where their grim trade is no longer needed, a world where justice and mercy walk hand in hand and the shadow of the scaffold fades at last into the light. For that, in the end, is the executioner's final legacy. Not the blood spilled or the lives taken, but the chance for us to learn from the mistakes of the past and chart a new course for the future. It's a heavy responsibility, but one we all share to build a world where cruelty and vengeance give way to compassion and grace. And though the road ahead may be long and the shadows deep, we can take comfort in the knowledge that we do not walk alone, for in the end we are all heirs to the executioner's legacy, the suffering and the sorrow, the hope and the redemption. It's a burden we all must bear, a story that belongs to us all. And in the telling, perhaps we can find the strength to write a new ending, one where the executioner's tale is not a warning, but a promise of a brighter tomorrow. So let us go forth with heavy hearts and steadfast spirits, carrying the weight of history on our shoulders. For in the end, it is up to us to shape the future, to build a world where the executioner's shadow fades at last into memory and the light of justice shines bright for all to see. As Johann Reichardt's grim career drew to a close, so too did the age of the traditional executioner. These dark figures, once a ubiquitous presence looming over medieval town squares, faded into the mists of history. Their blood-stained legacy became a fading memory, a shadowy reminder of a harsher, more brutal time. Yet even as the hooded axeman and the gallows noose receded from public view, the spectre of capital punishment lingered on. In hushed prison chambers and clinical execution rooms, the task of dealing out society's ultimate sanction simply assumed new forms. The electric chair's sizzling crackle and the lethal injection's eerie stillness replaced the sword's whistling slash and the trapdoor's fatal creak. Though more sterile and concealed, death's justice remained. As we reflect back on the executioner's macabre bet trade, It's tempting to view these figures as sadistic monsters or heartless machines. But beneath the hoods and behind the masks there beat the troubled hearts of men. Men burdened with a terrible duty, a grim responsibility that set them forever apart. Certainly some revelled in cruelty, drank deep of pain and fear, but others, perhaps most, were prisoners of circumstance, heirs to a family trade, a dark destiny, cogs in a vast machine of law and suffering, pied and shunned, yet also feared and strangely respected. Theirs was a twilight existence, balanced ever between the worlds of the living and the dead. To walk in the executioner's shoes, to bear his heavy axe and heavier conscience, is to confront the darkest extremes of the human condition, the stark finality of the death penalty, the uneasy relationship between justice and vengeance, the psychological toll of violence, whether enacted or merely witnessed. These troubling questions have stalked us throughout history, and they nip at our heels even now. So perhaps the hooded figure of the executioner is not some remote relic, but an enduring archetype, a reflection of society's own struggle to balance order and compassion, righteousness and mercy. In the executioner's haunted eyes and harrowed face, we may glimpse a part of ourselves, a reminder that even the most enlightened civilization at times must still grapple with the primal forces of darkness and light. The medieval executioner's story, in the end, is the story of human civilization itself, a halting, fitful climb from brutality to reason, from vengeance to justice, from savagery to mercy. A journey still unfolding, a tale whose final chapter remains unwritten. Though the axe and the noose may moulder on history's dung heap, the executioner's complex legacy endures. In our ongoing struggle to balance justice and humanity, we are all the executioner's heirs. Our shared hopes for a brighter tomorrow are hitched to the wisdom gleaned from his dark example. We may shudder at his memory, but we must never forget his lesson, that violence, even when cloaked in the majesty of law, exacts a terrible toll on victim and wielder alike. Only by confronting the darkness of our past may we grope our way towards a more enlightened future. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a solemn thought for the medieval executioner, that grim reaper, that shunned shadow, a figure of dread, fascination, of cruelty and posthos, a demon and a man, a reminder of what we once were and what we must never be again. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the executioner's dark empire. If you found this tale of history's darkest profession intriguing, or if it brought you a grim sort of comfort as you drift off to slumber, feel free to like this video and subscribe to my channel. There are many more tales of history, shadowed corners to explore, more dark stars to illuminate. Until next time, pleasant dreams, and remember, no matter how dark the night, dawn always comes, even for the executioner, even for us. Oh,